The lights inside the mansion glowed warm and golden, bouncing off crystal chandeliers and polished marble floors. Guests in elegant suits and glittering dresses moved between tables, their laughter mixing with the faint sound of a string quartet in the corner. Elijah stood near the far wall, his hands tucked into the pockets of his slightly too big jacket. The jacket had been borrowed from his foster guardian for the night, and the sleeves almost covered his fingers. He didn't care about the clothes. His eyes kept drifting to the grand piano sitting under a spotlight in the center of the room. Its surface shone like still water, the kind of piano he had only seen in magazines or online videos. His foster guardian, Mrs. Turner, stood beside him, scanning the crowd for familiar faces. She was the one who had convinced him to come to this charity event. "It's for a good cause," she had said, "and maybe you'll meet someone important." Elijah hadn't expected to meet anyone. He didn't belong here. But Mrs. Turner had a way of pushing him into situations he never thought he'd be in. Now here he was, in a room full of people who didn't even know his name. Across the room, laughter erupted from a small group gathered around a tall man with silver hair and a black tuxedo. Even from where Elijah stood, the man's presence felt heavy, commanding. That was Richard Hale, the man everyone was talking about tonight. A self-made tech millionaire, known for both his sharp business moves and his unpredictable personality. Some said he was generous, others whispered he was arrogant. Elijah only knew one thing about him. He was rumored to be an incredible pianist. Mrs. Turner noticed Elijah watching him and leaned closer. "Go," she whispered. "Ask him to play, just once, for the party." Elijah blinked at her. "What? I can't just walk up to him." "You can," she said, smiling in that stubborn way she always did. "You're not afraid of a piano. Don't be afraid of a man." The idea made his stomach twist. What if Richard laughed in his face? What if the crowd did? Still, his eyes went back to the piano. He imagined the keys under his fingers, the sound filling the room, the way music always made him forget where he was. Maybe if Richard played, he could hear something extraordinary tonight. The thought took root. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his heart starting to beat faster. Every step toward Richard felt heavier than the last. The closer he got, the louder the voices around him became, until it felt like all the conversations were pressing in on him. Richard was in the middle of a story, the people around him hanging on every word. Elijah stopped a few feet away, his throat dry. Richard's eyes slid over to him mid-sentence. The man's gaze was sharper than Elijah expected, like he could see through him in an instant. "Yes?" Richard said, his tone polite but edged with curiosity. Elijah's palms were damp. He swallowed, forcing the words out before his courage vanished. "Would you play the piano tonight?" The nearby conversations slowed, then faded. Heads turned toward them. Elijah felt the weight of every stare in the room. Someone gave a short, surprised laugh from the back. He wanted to shrink into the floor, but he kept his eyes on Richard. The millionaire didn't answer right away. He simply studied Elijah in silence, his expression unreadable. The pause stretched long enough that Elijah thought he might just turn away. But then Richard's mouth curved, not into a full smile, but something close. "And why?" Richard asked slowly. "Should I?" Elijah's heart thudded in his chest. He could have said a dozen things about music, about how amazing it would be to hear him play. But the words that came out were simple, unplanned, and completely honest. "Because music should come from the heart," he said quietly, "not the wallet." A murmur ran through the crowd. Elijah didn't know if it was approval or disbelief. His cheeks burned, but he didn't look away. Richard's eyes narrowed just slightly, not in anger, but in thought. The man set down his wine glass on a passing waiter's tray, still holding Elijah's gaze. Then, to everyone's surprise, he said, "I'll play, if you play first." The room shifted, voices rising in a wave of curiosity. Elijah's breath caught in his throat. This was not the answer he had expected. He had come here hoping to hear Richard play, not to put himself in the spotlight. But now every face in the room was turned toward him, waiting. Mrs. Turner's voice came from behind him, soft but firm. "Go on, Elijah. Show them." The grand piano seemed to loom larger than before, its polished surface reflecting the lights above. Elijah could feel his hands shaking as he took a slow step toward it, then another. The sound of his shoes against the marble floor was louder than he imagined. He reached the bench, running his fingers along the cool edge of the piano. He glanced back once, catching Richard watching him intently, his arms folded. The man's expression still gave nothing away. Elijah sat down, adjusting the bench slightly, his heart pounding so loud he could almost hear it over the soft hum of the room. He placed his hands above the keys, not touching them yet. The air felt heavy with expectation, like the moment before a storm. This was not how he had imagined the night. But now, with everyone waiting, he knew there was no turning back. Richard's eyes stayed on Elijah, calm but sharp, like he was reading every thought in the boy's head. The room around them was quiet now, except for the faint sound of glasses clinking from the far side of the hall. People leaned forward in their seats, curious to see if this small, shy boy would actually dare to touch the keys. Elijah's fingers hovered over the piano, but his chest felt tight. He had played in front of a few people before, at school recitals, in the church hall. But never like this, never with strangers dressed in diamonds and silk watching his every move, and never with a man like Richard Hale standing a few feet away, waiting. Richard tilted his head slightly. Well, his voice wasn't unkind, but it carried weight. If you want me to play, show me something worth following. The words stung a little, but they also lit a spark in Elijah's chest. Something worth following. He could do that. He had to do that. He took a slow, steady breath and pressed the first key. The sound was soft, like a whisper in a large, empty room. He let it linger, then followed with another and another, the notes weaving together into a melody that had lived in his mind for months. It was the song he had written for his mother. She had been gone for 2 years, but in his memory she was still there, singing in the kitchen, humming while she braided his hair when he was younger, tapping her foot to the rhythm of whatever he played on their old upright piano. That piano had missing keys and a soundboard that buzzed on certain notes, but she never cared. "Play it like you mean it," she used to say. "The heart is louder than the hands." As his fingers moved, Elijah forgot about the stairs, the glittering dresses, and the expensive suits. He forgot about Richard's watchful eyes. The music flowed from him, slow and aching at first, then rising like a tide. The melody carried the warmth of his mother's smile and the weight of losing her. It wasn't perfect. 1 or 2 notes came out sharper than he meant, but it was honest. Somewhere in the middle of the piece, he dared to look up. The crowd had changed. The polite, almost bored expressions were gone. People leaned forward, their eyes fixed on him. One woman dabbed at her eyes with a silk handkerchief. Even the servers had paused at the edges of the room, holding their trays still. Richard stood with his hands behind his back, his face unreadable, but his eyes were different. They were softer, like he had been pulled somewhere else, somewhere far away from the glitter and the noise of the party. Elijah reached the last part of his song, the part that always made his throat tighten when he practiced alone. The chords deepened, the notes stretched, and then he let the final tone ring out into the air, fading slowly until there was nothing but silence. For a moment, no one moved. Then, quietly, someone started to clap. The sound grew, spreading across the room until the applause filled the air. Elijah's chest rose and fell quickly, his fingers still tingling from the keys. Richard stepped forward, the applause dimming slightly as people waited to see what he would do. He walked to the piano and stopped beside Elijah, looking down at him. "What's your name?" he asked. "Elijah?" the boy said, his voice low. "Elijah," Richard repeated, as if testing the weight of it. Then he smiled, not the polite, distant smile he had worn earlier, but something warmer, almost personal. "Move over." Elijah blinked and slid to the left side of the bench, unsure what was about to happen. Richard sat beside him, his movements smooth and unhurried. He placed his hands on the keys, and for a moment, Elijah expected him to start some grand, impressive piece, something to show off his skill. But instead, Richard pressed a single note, then another. Slowly, carefully, he began to play, not something of his own, but Elijah's melody. The exact song Elijah had just played. The boy's eyes widened. Richard didn't just copy it, he built on it. He added low, rumbling harmonies that made the melody richer, fuller. His fingers danced across the keys with ease, pulling out sounds Elijah had never imagined for his own song. It was like hearing his music in color for the first time. The crowd was completely still, every ear tuned to the duet. Without speaking, Richard nodded at Elijah to join in. At first, Elijah hesitated, but then he placed his hands back on the keys, adding his original melody while Richard wove the deeper tones beneath it. The two of them played together, their parts rising and falling in perfect balance, like they had practiced this for years. When the last note rang out, the room erupted into applause, louder and more genuine than before. People stood from their seats, clapping and cheering. Some shouted Elijah's name after hearing Richard say it. Elijah turned to Richard, his heart still racing. "Why did you do that?" he asked quietly. Richard looked at him for a long moment, his smile fading into something more serious. "Because," he said, "you played with heart. That's rare. And when you hear something rare, you don't just ignore it." The words settled in Elijah's chest like a warm flame. For the first time that night, he didn't feel like an outsider in the room. He felt like he belonged. The piano cover was lifted, and the soft golden light from above made its polished surface shine like still water. Elijah could see his own reflection staring back at him as he approached. His legs felt heavy, as if each step toward the bench carried the weight of every doubt he'd ever had. Around him, voices had lowered to quiet murmurs. The room was no longer just a party. It felt like a stage. He sat down slowly, adjusting the bench so his knees fit comfortably under the keys. His fingers hovered just above them, but he didn't press down yet. The silence stretched, and in that silence, his heart pounded hard enough to feel in his throat. He thought of turning back, of shaking his head and telling Richard he couldn't do it. But then he remembered Mrs. Turner's voice in his ear earlier. "You're not afraid of a piano. Don't be afraid of a man." He let out a slow breath and touched the first key. The sound was soft, almost shy, but clear. He pressed another and then another, letting the notes form the opening of the song he knew better than his own heartbeat. It was the song he had written late at night, sitting at the old upright in Mrs. Turner's living room, trying to remember the warmth of his mother's voice. The melody began to grow, flowing like a quiet river. His hands started to move faster, the chords richer now, filling the space with more than just music. They carried the weight of his memories. His mother's laughter, the way she hummed while folding laundry, the mornings when she'd wake him early to watch the sunrise together before school. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the feeling guide him. It didn't matter that his jacket sleeves were too long or that his shoes were scuffed. Right now, the piano was his whole world. Each note seemed to rise and wrap around the people in the room, pulling them into the story he was telling without words. When he opened his eyes again, he caught sight of the guests. Their expressions had shifted. No one was glancing at their phones or sipping wine distractedly. A man in the front row leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. A woman near the back held her clasped hands under her chin. Even the servers carrying trays had stopped moving, standing frozen by the walls. Richard stood a short distance away, watching. His arms were still folded across his chest, but his face had changed. He wasn't wearing the cool, unreadable mask he'd had before. There was something softer there, something Elijah couldn't quite name. The song reached its middle section, where the chords deepened and the melody stretched into something bittersweet. Elijah's fingers pressed harder now, the sound growing stronger, filling every corner of the room. He thought of the last day he saw his mother, of the hug that felt like it should have lasted forever, and the way the house felt too quiet afterward. He put all of it into the keys, letting the music say what he could never say out loud. The sound swelled, and for a moment, Elijah forgot there were people watching. He was somewhere else, in that old living room with sunlight coming through the window, his mother's voice humming along softly. He let the feeling carry him into the final part of the piece. The notes slowed, the melody softened again, like a fading memory you try to hold on to before it slips away. Then came the last note. He held it just a fraction longer than necessary, letting it linger in the air before lifting his hands from the keys. Silence followed. For a heartbeat, the room was utterly still. He could hear the faint tick of the large wall clock, the sound of someone's breath catching. And then slowly, the applause began. It started with one person, then two, until the sound spread across the room in a rising wave. People clapped with open smiles, some even standing. Elijah's shoulders eased, but his heart still pounded. His hands were trembling slightly, not from fear now, but from the rush of having given something of himself and been heard. Richard stepped forward. The applause quieted as he approached, the sound fading into anticipation. He came to stand beside the piano, his tall frame casting a shadow over the bench. That, he said in a low voice that still carried through the room, was worth listening to. Elijah looked up at him, unsure what to say. Richard's eyes held his for a moment longer before the man walked around to the other side of the bench. Without asking, he sat down next to Elijah, adjusting his position so they both had space on the keys. Elijah frowned slightly, confused. Was Richard going to play over his song? Show him how it was supposed to be done? Instead, Richard pressed a single note, then another, and Elijah recognized them instantly. It was his own melody. But the way Richard played it was different. He slowed certain phrases, let some notes breathe longer, and when the chords came, he added depth to them, layering in low tones that made the whole piece sound bigger, warmer. The boy's eyes widened. This wasn't copying, it was building. Richard was taking his song and painting over it with colors Elijah didn't know existed. The melody swelled under the millionaire's skilled hands, and then Richard glanced at Elijah, tilting his head toward the keys, as if saying, "Join me." Hesitating only for a second, Elijah placed his fingers back on the piano and began playing alongside him. The two parts blended seamlessly. Richard's deeper harmonies wrapped around Elijah's original melody like they had been meant for each other all along. It felt like a conversation without words, a shared language only the two of them understood in that moment. The music rose and fell, both of them giving space for the other to speak. By the time they reached the end, Elijah's chest felt full, almost too full to breathe. The last note rang out and faded, leaving only silence. This time, the applause was instant and thunderous. People stood, clapping and cheering, some calling Elijah's name. He looked over at Richard, who gave a small, approving nod. It wasn't showy or dramatic, but in that nod, Elijah felt something he hadn't in a long time, the quiet certainty that he had been seen. The moment the applause died down, Richard shifted slightly on the bench, his fingers still resting on the keys. He looked straight ahead, his eyes focused on the piano, as if the rest of the room had disappeared. Then, without any warning, he began to play. The first notes were low and steady, like the sound of distant thunder rolling across an open field. His touch was confident, but not rushed. He played with the kind of control that came from years of practice, yet there was something raw in the way the notes carried emotion. The melody wasn't flashy, not meant to show off. It was deep, almost like it was speaking in a language older than words. Elijah sat beside him, listening, trying to follow the path of the music. It wasn't a piece he recognized. Richard wasn't playing a song from a book. He was building something right there in the moment. And then Elijah realized what it was. The base of the melody came from his own song, the one he had just played. Richard was taking it apart, stretching it, twisting it, and reshaping it into something entirely new. The crowd was silent again, leaning in to hear every detail. Even the people at the very back of the room could feel the weight in each note. There was a sense of storytelling in the way Richard's fingers moved, sometimes soft and delicate, other times strong and commanding. He would pause just enough to let the sound linger before moving on, like he was allowing the music to breathe. Then, as the melody rose higher, Richard turned his head slightly toward Elijah, giving him a small nod. It was an invitation. Elijah hesitated, his fingers hovering above the keys. The idea of playing alongside a man like Richard in front of this audience made his pulse race. But there was no sharp pressure in Richard's expression, only a quiet expectation, like he knew Elijah could do it. Elijah placed his hands on the keys and began to play his original melody, the one that had been the heart of his performance earlier. This time, it felt different. Richard's deeper harmonies surrounded it, filling in spaces Elijah hadn't realized were empty before. The notes fit together like puzzle pieces, and the music grew into something neither of them could have created alone. They weren't just playing side by side, they were answering each other, passing the melody back and forth. When Elijah's part rose, Richard's dropped to give it space. When Richard's fingers swept across the higher keys, Elijah's chords filled the bottom. The two sounds blended so well it was hard to tell where one ended and the other began. People in the crowd were no longer just watching, they were leaning forward, caught in the moment. A woman covered her mouth, eyes glistening. A man near the front kept shaking his head slowly, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. The room felt smaller now, as though the music had pulled everyone closer together. Richard began to shift the melody again, adding subtle changes that made Elijah listen harder. Without speaking, he was teaching him, showing him how a simple tune could be layered, bent, and reshaped into endless variations. Elijah tried to follow, matching him when he could, learning in real time. It felt like trying to keep up with a river's current, and yet he found himself doing it. There was a moment when their hands nearly brushed as they crossed over the keys. Elijah caught Richard's glance, and for a split second, there was the smallest smile there. It wasn't the smile of a man showing off. It was the smile of someone enjoying the music just as much as the person beside him. The piece built toward a high emotional point, both of them pressing into the keys with energy and focus. Then, just as suddenly, Richard began to slow. The melody softened, the chords stretched out, and the notes fell like drops of rain on still water. Elijah followed, letting his part fade into the background, while Richard carried the last few measures alone. The final note hung in the air, vibrating in the silence before it dissolved completely. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The stillness was heavy, almost fragile, like any sound might break it. And then the applause came, not the polite kind, but the loud, genuine kind that filled the room with warmth. People rose from their seats, clapping hard, some even whistling. Elijah felt his chest rise and fall quickly. His hands were trembling again, but not from fear. It was from the rush of what had just happened. He turned to Richard, ready to say something, but the man spoke first. "You have something rare," Richard said quietly, his voice almost lost in the sound of the crowd. "Don't ever let anyone convince you otherwise." Elijah swallowed, unsure how to respond. He had never heard words like that from someone like Richard. Before he could speak, Richard stood, resting a hand lightly on Elijah's shoulder. The touch was brief but steady, like a promise. Then Richard turned to the audience, his voice carrying easily across the room. "That," he said, motioning toward Elijah, "is a musician worth listening to. Remember his name." The applause swelled again, even louder than before. Elijah's ears buzzed with it. He looked out over the crowd, and for the first time he didn't feel small or out of place. He felt like he belonged exactly where he was. As the guests slowly began to talk among themselves again, Richard remained standing beside the piano, his hands still resting lightly on the polished surface. His gaze stayed on Elijah for a moment, longer than the boy expected. There was something in his eyes now, not just admiration, but recognition, like he was looking at someone from a memory. "You know," Richard began, his tone softer now, almost thoughtful, "your mother would be proud." The words hit Elijah like a sudden gust of wind. His fingers tightened against the edge of the bench. He hadn't told anyone here about his mother. He hadn't even mentioned her name tonight. Confusion flickered across his face. How do you know about her?" Richard didn't answer immediately. He glanced around the room, noticing the way a few curious guests were trying to listen in. He gave a small nod toward a quieter corner near the piano, and Elijah followed him. When they stopped, Richard's voice lowered even more. "Years ago," he said slowly, "before the companies, before the money, I was broke. Completely. I was living out of a tiny apartment, wondering if I had made a mistake chasing music and business at the same time." His eyes seemed distant now, as if he was watching the scenes of his past unfold in front of him. "There was a little church down the street. I used to go there on Sundays, not because I was religious, but because they had a piano I could play when no one else was around." Elijah listened, his heart beating faster. "One evening," Richard continued, "I was sitting there at the piano, frustrated, ready to give it all up. That's when she came in. Your mother. She didn't know me. She just heard the music and walked over. She said," he paused as if hearing her voice again in his mind, "Don't quit before the song is over." The phrase sent a shiver through Elijah. He could almost hear his mother saying it, because she had many times to him. Richard gave a faint smile. "She stayed for a while that night, sang along to whatever I played. Her voice—" He shook his head slightly. "It had a way of making the air feel warmer. I never forgot it." Elijah's throat felt tight. He hadn't expected to hear his mother's name tonight, let alone this story. He had always known she was kind, but the idea that she had once sat with a stranger in an empty church, giving him the same encouragement she gave her own son, it made something ache deep inside him. Richard looked at him with quiet seriousness. When I saw you at the piano tonight, I recognized something in the way you play. That same heart she had when she sang. And when you told me music should come from the heart, not the wallet. He let out a small breath. It was like hearing her speak again. Elijah stared at the floor for a moment, trying to hold back the emotion building in his chest. She used to say that to me too, he said quietly. Richard's smile deepened, but there was sadness in it. Then you already know how rare that is. He glanced toward the crowd, who were still enjoying their drinks and conversations, unaware of the weight of the moment between them. Most people hear music. Very few feel it. Your mother did. You do too. There was a pause, and Elijah found himself searching Richard's face, trying to decide if this man, this wealthy, powerful figure, was really telling the truth. But there was no sign of insincerity. The way Richard spoke about his mother, the details he remembered, the tone in his voice, it was all real. The air between them felt heavy with unspoken things. Elijah wanted to ask 100 questions. What exactly had they talked about? Did she remember him afterward? Did she ever mention meeting a struggling pianist who later became a millionaire? But before he could speak, Richard gave his shoulder a gentle squeeze. You remind me of her, he said. Not just in your playing, but in your courage. It's not easy to walk up to a stranger in front of a crowd and ask them to share something personal. But you did, and I'm glad you did. Elijah didn't know what to say. He felt a strange mix of pride and grief twisting inside him. Pride, because someone as accomplished as Richard saw a piece of his mother in him. Grief, because she wasn't here to see it herself. Richard stepped back slightly, straightening his jacket. She gave me something I didn't realize I needed back then. A reason to keep going. I'd like to return the favor, in a way. Elijah frowned slightly. What do you mean? The older man's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. You'll see. And with that, Richard walked back toward the center of the room where a few people were waiting to speak to him. Elijah stayed where he was, still processing everything. The sound of the crowd faded in his ears, replaced by the memory of his mother's voice singing softly in their old living room. He realized now that the night had already changed something. He had come here thinking he might just hear a famous man play the piano. Instead, he had found an unexpected connection, one that reached back years before he was even old enough to understand it. For the rest of the evening, every time he glanced at Richard, he saw not just a millionaire, but a man who had once been a stranger in need of encouragement and who had carried the memory of his mother with him all these years. It felt like a thread tying the past to the present, invisible but strong, and Elijah knew he would never forget it. The music had faded, the applause had died down, and the night seemed to be settling into quiet conversation again when Richard turned to face the crowd. His voice rose just enough to cut through the background noise. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, I have an announcement to make. People stopped mid-sentence, their attention shifting to him. Even the waiters froze where they stood, holding trays in the air. Elijah felt his chest tighten as Richard's gaze moved toward him. This young man, Richard continued, resting a hand on Elijah's shoulder, has something you can't buy. Talent, yes, but more importantly, heart. And when you have that, you deserve more than applause. You deserve a chance. A ripple of curiosity moved through the crowd. Guests exchanged glances, some leaning forward to hear what would come next. Richard took a breath. From this day on, I will personally sponsor Elijah's music education. I'll cover every lesson, every competition, every instrument he needs. And, he added with a small smile, I'm buying him his own grand piano. For a second, the room was completely silent. Then the applause burst out, louder than any before. Some guests stood, clapping and cheering. Elijah stood frozen, unsure if he had heard right. Mrs. Turner was beside him now, her hands covering her mouth, her eyes wide and shining. Elijah, she whispered, do you understand what this means? But he didn't. Not fully. All he knew was that a man he had only met tonight was offering him something he had never dared to dream about. Richard wasn't finished. He raised a hand to quiet the crowd. Music changed my life once, he said. It gave me a reason to fight when I wanted to quit. I see that same fight in this boy, and I'll do everything I can to make sure the world hears him." People clapped again, some even calling out words of encouragement. Elijah's cheeks felt hot, and his throat was tight. He tried to speak, but nothing came out. Richard leaned closer so only he could hear. "This isn't charity, Elijah. This is an investment in you. Because one day I think you'll be the one sitting where I am, helping the next person who needs it." Elijah finally managed to whisper, "Thank you." Richard smiled, patting his shoulder once before stepping away to greet another group of guests. The crowd around Elijah began to shift, people coming up to shake his hand, to tell him how moved they were by his playing. Some asked about his music, others simply said they were looking forward to hearing more from him in the future. It all felt like a blur. The warmth of the lights, the noise of so many voices, the weight of so many eyes. It was overwhelming, but in the best way. For the first time in his life, Elijah didn't feel invisible. When the party began to wind down and guests started leaving, Mrs. Wyatt Turner led him toward the exit. The night air outside was cool and crisp, a sharp contrast to the heat inside. They walked in silence for a few minutes, the sound of their shoes echoing on the pavement. Finally, she spoke. "You know, Elijah, this could change everything for you." "I know," he said softly, though the words still felt unreal in his mouth. She gave a small smile. "Your mother would have been so proud tonight, not just because you played beautifully, but because you were brave enough to ask." He didn't answer right away. His mind kept replaying the moment at the piano, the look on Richard's face, the way their music had fit together, like it had been meant to all along. By the time they reached home, Elijah was exhausted but unable to sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, hearing the faint echo of the applause in his head. Every time he thought about the grand piano Richard had promised, his chest felt light and heavy at the same time. The next morning, Mrs. Turner knocked on his door. "Come downstairs," she said. "You have a delivery." Still half asleep, Elijah followed her into the living room and stopped. A delivery crew stood there, carefully unwrapping a glossy black Steinway grand piano. Its surface gleamed in the morning light streaming through the window. The golden letters of the brand name caught his eye, and for a moment, he could only stare. One of the movers handed him an envelope. Inside was a small card with Richard's neat handwriting. "Play for the world. I believe in you." Elijah's fingers tightened around the card. The movers finished setting up the piano, placing the bench neatly in front of it. When they left, the room felt different, like it had been waiting for this moment. He sat down on the bench, his heart beating fast. The keys were cool under his fingers, smooth and perfectly weighted. He pressed one, then another, and the sound was rich, warm, and full. It was unlike anything he had ever played before. The tones filled the room and seemed to wrap around him, pulling him in. He began to play his mother's song, the same one from the night before, but now it felt bigger, freer, alive in a way it never had on the old upright. As the melody flowed, Elijah thought of Richard's words, of his mother's encouragement, of the way music had connected them across years and strangers. He knew now that this wasn't just a gift, it was a challenge. To live up to the belief someone had placed in him, to carry the song forward, no matter how hard the road became. When he finished playing, the last note lingered in the air before fading into silence. Elijah sat there, hands still on the keys, a small smile tugging at his lips. For the first time, he didn't just dream about becoming a great pianist. He believed it could really happen. The first week after the piano arrived, Elijah spent every spare moment at the keys. Morning, afternoon, and sometimes late at night, when the neighborhood was quiet, he would sit there, letting his fingers wander. At first, he played the same familiar songs, but soon he started creating new melodies, building on the emotions he had felt that night at the mansion. The sound of the Steinway was so full and rich that even simple notes felt powerful. Sometimes, Mrs. Turner would pause in the hallway just to listen, leaning against the wall with a small smile. She didn't interrupt. She knew the music was becoming part of him in a deeper way now. One evening, Elijah was practicing when his phone buzzed on the edge of the piano. He picked it up to see an unknown number. When he answered, a warm, steady voice came through. "Elijah? It's Richard Hale." His heart jumped. "Oh, hello, sir." "I'm not going to keep you long," Richard said. I just wanted to check in. How's the piano treating you? Elijah glanced at the shining black surface beside him. It's amazing. I've never played anything like it. That's good, Richard replied, because I have another favor to ask. Elijah frowned slightly. A favor? There's a small benefit concert next month, Richard explained. It's not huge, but it's for a cause I care about. I'd like you to perform a piece there, something that's yours. The words sank in slowly. You mean play in front of people? Again? Yes, Richard said simply. But not just any people. This will be a room full of musicians, producers, and teachers, the kind of people who could help you take the next step. Elijah's hands felt sweaty just thinking about it. He remembered the nerves from the mansion, the weight of every eye in the room, but he also remembered the feeling of the music carrying him through and the sound of applause that followed. I'll do it, he said finally, his voice quiet but sure. Richard didn't praise him or make a big deal of it. Good, I'll have someone send you the details. And then the line clicked off. From that day on, Elijah's practice changed. He wasn't just playing for himself anymore. He was preparing for something bigger. He started waking up earlier to fit in extra hours at the piano. He wrote and rewrote the piece he planned to play, adding little changes, testing new chords. Some nights, frustration made him want to give up, but he kept hearing Richard's voice. This isn't charity. It's an investment. The night of the concert arrived faster than he expected. Mrs. Turner helped him into the same jacket he had worn to the mansion, this time fitting a little better because she had tailored the sleeves. They took a cab to the venue, a small but elegant theater with red velvet seats and golden lights along the walls. Backstage, Elijah could hear the muffled sound of the audience arriving. His hands were cold, and he rubbed them together to keep them warm. A stage manager poked her head in. 5 minutes, she said. He nodded, his stomach twisting with nerves. But then, just before he stepped out, he saw Richard waiting in the wings. He was dressed in a simple dark suit, no flashy watch or tie, just watching quietly. You ready? Richard asked. I think so, Elijah said. Don't think, Richard replied. Feel, play like you did the night we met. Elijah took a deep breath and walked onto the stage. The lights were bright, blinding at first, but as he sat at the piano, everything else faded. He placed his hands on the keys and began to play. The piece started slow, the opening notes carrying the same softness his mother used to hum into his songs. Then it grew, the chords swelling with more confidence, more life. He thought about every moment that had led him here. The small church where his mother sang, the night at the mansion, the Steinway arriving at his door. Halfway through, he stopped thinking altogether. His fingers moved on instinct, and the music told its own story. There were moments of joy, moments of loss, and moments where both lived together in the same note. When he reached the final part, he let the melody slow again, the way a sunset eases into darkness. The last chord lingered in the air before melting into silence. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the applause came, rolling through the theater like a wave. Elijah stood and gave a small bow, his cheeks warm. From the corner of his eye, he saw Richard rise to his feet, clapping steadily, his expression calm but proud. After the show, people came up to Elijah backstage. A music teacher handed him a business card. A producer told him he had real potential. Someone else invited him to audition for a youth music program in the city. It was a blur of handshakes, smiles, and congratulations. But through it all, Richard stayed back, letting others speak to him first. When they were finally alone for a moment, Elijah looked up at him. You were right, he said. This feels like the start of something. Richard's mouth curved into the smallest smile. It is, and it's only the beginning. As they left the theater together, Elijah felt lighter than he had in years. For the first time, the future didn't seem like a distant dream. It felt close enough to touch. Years passed, but Elijah never forgot the night in the mansion when everything began. The Steinway still stood in his living room, its black surface polished to a mirror shine, but now it was joined by trophies, framed certificates, and photographs from performances all over the world. He had played in small theaters, grand concert halls, and on stages where the lights were so bright he could barely see the audience. But no matter how big the stage, Elijah always kept a part of himself anchored to that first night, the night he found out that courage could change the course of a life. It was a warm evening in New York City when he stepped onto one of the most famous stages in the world, Carnegie Hall. The hall was packed, every seat taken, the air buzzing with the low hum of conversation. He could see reporters in the front rows, photographers with their cameras ready, and musicians he had once only read about sitting among the audience. Backstage, he stood in front of the mirror, dressed in a crisp black suit. His hands were steady now, no longer the trembling fingers of the boy who once asked a stranger to play the piano. He heard the stage manager's voice. 2 minutes, Elijah. He nodded, his chest calm but full, like the steady beat before the first note of a song. As he walked toward the stage entrance, his eyes caught sight of a familiar figure in the shadows. Richard Hale was there, older now, with more silver in his hair, but still carrying that same quiet presence. Their eyes met, and Richard gave him a small nod. No words were needed. The host announced his name, and the applause swelled as Elijah stepped into the light. He crossed the stage to the grand piano, each step echoing in the hushed hall. Sitting down, he placed his hands over the keys, taking one slow breath before beginning. The first notes flowed out, soft and delicate, the same opening from the piece he had played all those years ago in the mansion. It was his mother's song, but now it had grown, richer, fuller, carrying the weight of all the years between then and now. The melody told the story of his journey from the small living room with a worn-out upright to the shining stage before thousands. As he played, his mind wandered briefly, not in distraction, but in reflection. He thought of his mother's voice, of Mrs. Turner's steady encouragement, of Richard's challenge to play something worth following. He thought of the nights he practiced until his hands ached, of the competitions he lost, and the moments he wanted to quit. All of it was in the music now, stitched into every chord and pause. When the piece reached its middle, Elijah shifted into something new, a section that had never been written down, only played in his private moments. It was a duet section, but tonight he played both parts alone, weaving harmonies and melodies as if Richard were still sitting beside him, just like the first time. In the front row, Richard leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving the keys. The final section came quietly, the notes fading like the end of a memory. Elijah let the last chord linger, his fingers holding it just a moment longer before releasing it into silence. The hall was still for a breath, and then the applause crashed over him like a wave. People stood, clapping hard, cheering his name. He rose from the bench, bowing deeply, but his eyes went to Richard first. The older man was on his feet, clapping with the same steady rhythm he had years ago, a faint but proud smile on his face. After the performance, the backstage area filled with people congratulating him, shaking his hand, offering contracts and invitations. Elijah smiled politely, but his mind was fixed on finding Richard. When he finally spotted him near the side exit, he crossed the room quickly. "You made it," Elijah said, his voice warm. "I wouldn't miss it," Richard replied. "You've done exactly what I thought you would." Elijah chuckled softly. "You mean I didn't ruin your investment?" Richard shook his head. "You multiplied it, and not just with music. I've heard about the kids you mentor, the programs you fund. You're already doing what I hoped, passing it on." Elijah shrugged lightly. "I'm just giving back what I was given." They stood in silence for a moment, the noise of the crowd behind them fading. Finally, Richard said, "Your mother would be proud, more than proud." The words hit Elijah the same way they had the first time, but now they carried a sense of completion, like a circle closing. Outside, the night air was cool, the city lights reflecting off the wet pavement from an earlier rain. They walked together for a short while, not saying much. At the corner, Richard paused, turning to him. "This is your life now, Elijah. But don't forget, every note you play is part of a larger song, one that started long before you sat at that piano in my house." Elijah nodded. "I know, and I'll keep playing it." They shook hands, a firm grip that spoke of years of respect and shared history. Richard stepped into a waiting car, and Elijah watched it disappear into the city traffic. When he returned home later that night, the Steinway was there, waiting in the same place it had always been. He sat down, loosened his tie, and began to play again, not for an audience, not for applause, but for himself and for the people who had carried him here. The music filled the quiet room, and somewhere in the sound, he could almost hear his mother humming along, just as she used to.